Welcome to the first episode of Repair, Rewear, a series to hold me accountable for all the damaged clothing or pieces in need of alterations that I buy. The first project is this beautiful dress from the Prada Fall/Winter 2001 collection that was worn by Maggie Reiser on the runway. I purchased this from eBay over a year ago for $90, which is honestly not a great price for all the work I ended up putting into just patching the dress. Please note that this video is not meant to be a tutorial. It's more a record for me, an accountability tool, and just something fun to practice. I do give some explanations of certain parts of the process, but there's really no rhyme or reason at this time of how I decide where to slow down and what I devote more time to explain. I will link videos and other resources that I personally found really helpful while I was working on this project. Another disclaimer, this video is long. It's a record of what I spent my free time working on for just over a month. It's completely time-stamped to help you skip around to whatever interests you most. I keep all of my alteration projects in this vacuum sealed bag, just for general organization and tidiness. My goal is to finish altering all the pieces in this bag by the end of the year. So the first piece that I want to start altering is this dress from Prada. It's in a beautiful purple shade that I call Prada purple because I see it used in a lot of their collections, and even if a show doesn't feature any purple items, many times some of the pieces that actually become available for purchase, they are available in a purple iteration. So this dress is a size Italian 40, which is my size, but Prada 40 generally is a little bit large on me. So this piece unfortunately has a bunch of moth holes. It's made out of this very nice wool fabric, and I believe it's a double layer of that wool and then lined in silk. Maybe this is silk, I think. But it has a bunch of moth holes all over the place. Some of these moth holes I will not be able to fix, like probably these here at the neckline, but I'm going to try and see if I can do invisible mending on some of these holes here. So there's that one, these notable ones, noticeable ones. Unfortunately, the most noticeable moth holes are on the front of the dress. Here they're big enough that they're casting shadows, so they're quite easy to spot. There are a few of them on the back as well that aren't as noticeable, but I will be trying to mend those invisibly as well. Oops. I purchased this dress from an eBay seller for I think about $90, and in retrospect I shouldn't have made the purchase at all because number one, this sort of A-line cut from Prada usually doesn't fit me if it's a size 40, and two, the seller did note that the garment had moth holes. They just didn't look as bad in the seller's photographs. But what's done is done. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to learn and practice alteration and a new repair technique. So this is the dress on. I do have my shorts underneath and I kept my bralette on, but as you can see there's a ton of space on top and throughout the rest of the dress as well. So this is the dress on. My apologies for the smudgy mirror. The dress has side seams and I'll be using those to take in the dress. My goal is to get the top part around the bust quite fitted. I'm going to take in the waist a little bit, but kind of have that still skimming my body. And I'm also going to be changing the shape of the skirt just a little bit. I'm going to take a little bit extra when I'm taking in the sides to make the skirt look a little bit straighter. And because I'm doing that, I'm going to be adding, or at least I'm planning to add, a vent to the back so that there is still room for movement. Other considerations for the alteration of this dress is that these buttons that are used to attach the waistband, the decorative waistband, will be moving to the side if I'm taking in the dress from the side. So I will be moving them towards the center of the dress to compensate for the amount that I'm taking in from the side, because I still want the waistband to be fairly visible. And because I'm taking in the dress, the waistband will also have to be shortened. I'm going to be shaving off one end of the waistband to move all the buttons so that they stay aligned with the buttons on the dress. I will be opening the side of this waistband just so that I can remove and then reattach these buttons at their new location. One thing that is making me apprehensive about this alteration is how well finished the garment is, as expected from Prada. And I want to maintain how well finished it is, but I don't know if I know that I'm not skilled enough, but I will have to push myself. The first thing I did was use a seam ripper to take apart the side seams of the outer fabric and the lining. Then I turned the dress inside out and pinned it on myself using ballpoint pins. I would recommend that if you are working by yourself and you're pinning the garment on your body instead of a form, for example, that you use safety pins because it is safer. The next step was to use the pins to help me mark the new seams with tailor's chalk. I also had to correct the placement of the seams because when you're pinning a garment, especially if you're doing it to a garment that you're wearing, you're going to end up pinning unevenly. It's inevitable. I call this process the redistribution math part of alterations. Tools you'll need are tailor's chalk, a sewing gauge, or a measuring tape, and a French curve to help you connect points and marks that you make. I do this before I base stitch the dress with my machine. These are simplified drawings of the front and back panels of the dress. The shaded purple here is the original seam allowance. The red line is the original seam, and the dashed gray line is the new seam, which you make by drawing over the pins on the dress with tailor's chalk or whatever you use to mark your fabric. As I said previously, what happens when you're pinning a garment, especially if you're pinning it on yourself, is that you will not pin the new seams perfectly even on all edges of the panels of your garment. If you check the measurement between the new seam and the old seam at the same vertical point on the dress, you'll often find that the measurements will differ on all the edges at that same vertical point. Let's say, for example, you measure the difference between the old and new seams at point A. It might measure 1/2 inch on the right side of the front panel, whereas on the left side, you may have pinched 1.5 inch. Now, if you're lucky, maybe on the back, you'll have pinned 1 inch on both sides from the original seams. If I were to add up the measurements at this vertical point, just at all the edges, I would have 1/2 inch here, 1.5 inch on the left, and then 2 inches total from the back panel. If I add that up, that gives me 4 inches. That simply means that I'm taking 4 inches away from the dress at point A. Now, if I want to redistribute that 4 inches evenly to all 4 edges of these two panels, all I have to do is take 4 inches and divide that by the number of edges, in this case 4, which will give me 1 inch per edge. On the back of point A, I have already drawn the new seam 1 inch away from the old seam on both edges, so I don't have to make any changes here. However, in the front, I'm going to make a small mark 1/2 inch to the left of the new seam on the right. That also means that this mark that I'm making is 1 inch from the old seam. On the left edge of the dress, I'm going to make a mark that's 1/2 inch to the left of the new seam here. That means this new mark is 1 inch away from the old seam. I do that redistribution mathematics along the vertical length of the dress at multiple points. Finally, at the end, I can use my tailor's chalk and the French curve to help me connect all the marks made during this redistribution process. Now I have fixed the seam lines so that they are even on all edges, and I'm finally ready to base stitch the 2 panels together following these corrected seam lines. On the little paper panels, I actually did do the redistribution math along the entire vertical length of the paper garment. So you can see now that the black seam lines are even compared to the dashed blue lines. I tried on the dress after base stitching it. It's to be expected that you'll continue to make adjustments at this point. That's the whole purpose of base stitching. These are not permanent stitches. They're only meant to help you determine where you will make your permanent stitch. I made plenty of adjustments, which meant rebasting and trying on the dress many times. Just be patient. It's best to work carefully at this point so you can ensure that the dress will fit you exactly how you want it to fit at the end of all of your hard work. After fitting the bust, the straps actually stood above my shoulders, so I had to shorten them. This alteration wasn't so bad. I pinned the straps while I had the dress on, which helped me figure out I needed to shorten the straps by 2 centimeters. The strap is basically a tube made of 2 rectangles to create a longer rectangle that was then closed on the long edge before it was pulled out. The seam where the 2 panels are connected is right at my shoulder. I had to seam rip that open along with part of the long side seam. I only trimmed off the excess on the back panel, effectively moving that shoulder seam toward my back by 2 centimeters. I had to use a ladder stitch, also known as a slip stitch, to close up the sides since I couldn't flip the tube inside out. This stitch is an invisible stitch to close gaps and seams when you can't access the back. Voila, done. When I first basted the dress, I stopped just past my hips, leaving the bottom sides open. I actually considered adding side slits instead of the single back vent because I like a good exposed leg and I thought I could avoid seam ripping another seam. But the fabric was too heavy, so the edges kept flaring out no matter what I did. You can see the flare even when I left only 2 inches opened at the bottom of the side seams. Once I finally closed the side seams, I decided to finish with mitered corners. 2 connected mitered corners at each side seam. This was a rash decision made when I was tired and weak from working too long on the dress. Mitered corners are usually found on the corners of a panel of fabric that is not sewn to other panels. That is to say, mitered corners are not found at a seam. It doesn't look bad, but it wasn't necessary at all. I thought I could reduce some of the bulkiness from folding the seam allowance at the bottom hem, but that was how the dress was originally finished. A straight stitch down the entire side, then the seam was pressed flat, and then the bottom hem was folded up and pressed very well. I wouldn't recommend trying to incorporate mitered corners into your seams. There's no benefit and it's challenging. I did it with the goal of reducing bulk, but when I pressed the fabric, I could kind of make out the seams created by the mitered corner on the outside of the dress. You live and learn. This finish would have been great for the corners of the open back slit, but I didn't have enough seam allowance to do it confidently. To figure out how I would alter the waistband, I first positioned one end of the band on me when I was trying on the dress to determine where I would have to move the buttons on the front of the dress. I marked where the button on the band would snap to the new position of the button on the dress with a pin. After I took off the dress, I stitched that one button to its new position on the dress. I needed this first button repositioned and secured to the dress in order to finish the alterations of the waistband. What I did next was lay the dress flat and snap the band onto that first button that I had just finished moving. I then wrapped the band around the dress. You can see that the left end here needs to be shortened as it's much closer to the center of the dress than the right end of the band. I pinned the left side to the front of the dress to prevent the band from slipping around. Then I flipped to the back of the dress and using the back center seam as a guide, I was able to pin the center of the band. I then pinned where I would move the button on the back of the band. I measured the distance of this button to the center of the band to figure out where to position the remaining right back button. Then I removed the band and measured the left button position to the left edge, the edge that was snapped to the garment, which I will not be trimming. I used that measurement to then mark the new edge on the right side. I then opened up one side of the sash to give me access to the back of the wool fabric so I could reposition the buttons and trim the right side. One thing I want to note is that the panels of the sash was cut so that the purple panel is slightly larger, allowing it to kind of curve over the edge so that the aubergine fabric doesn't show at the edge. Maintaining that particular finish was difficult and I didn't really manage to pull it off. You'll see later that the aubergine fabric is a little bit more visible on the side where I trimmed the waistband, but it doesn't bother me too much. Because I had opened the side seam, I was able to flip the waistband inside out. I machine stitched that side seam as much as I could before leaving about a 3-inch gap so that I could pull the outside of the sash back outside. I hope that makes sense. Unfortunately, I didn't film that part. To finish closing the gap invisibly, I again used the ladder stitch. Finally, I pressed the sash and put my old OChem textbook on top of it to help flatten it as much as possible. After I closed up the sides of the outer fabric, I got to working on the lining. So I have to be honest, I didn't do a great job trimming the excess off of the lining, and it ended up being slightly bigger than the outer dress. It was challenging to work with the silk fabric while it was still attached to the outer dress, but I made it work more or less. I stitched up the sides and then I reattached the lining to the underarm area here. The dress was originally understitched in this area, and I also understitched to keep the lining from popping up or riding up in this area. I also added some small permanent tacking stitches near the side seam to secure the lining to the outer shell. This is just something to prevent the lining from moving so much in this area. After sewing up the sides of the lining and closing the gap between the outer fabric and the lining underneath the armpits, I needed to reattach the lining to the bottom hem of the dress. I had removed some of the stitching at the folded hem that helps maintain the structure of the hem. You can see the very fine threads here. I actually ended up buying some microfilament thread to finish the project. I used the microfilament thread to catch stitch or hem stitch the folded hem in the areas where I had removed the original stitches. The thread is, not surprisingly, super fine, and I'm glad that I have it now for other projects. I used my machine to reattach the lining to the bottom hem as much as I could where I had opened the dress, but I did have to hand stitch the area where the machine couldn't really reach, the area that was very close to the side seams. I used back stitches for these hand stitches. I also used some small stitches to permanently tack the lining to the outer fabric at the bottom side seams as well. These tacking stitches basically keep the lining in place and prevent it from shifting around too much. At the vent that I had created in the back, I made sure to backstitch with the machine at the point where the vent begins. I folded and pressed the bottom corners of the edges of the back vent. I had decided to fold the lining over and under the hem, and again, I wanted to minimize the silk showing at the edge of the slit opening. After I folded and pressed those corners, I positioned the silk lining where I wanted it to be along the vent and pinned the silk to the edges. I had to refold the edge of the lining on the right quite a bit being like 1/2 centimeter. I couldn't really iron out the original fold or iron in the new fold on the lining at this part for whatever reason, so I used the pins. Again, I used my heavy old chem book to really help set the new folds. I ended up using the microfilament thread to secure the seam allowance of the back center seam to keep it flat against the fabric. I used a variation of a whip stitch, and as you can see, that was done by hand. You can also see that the vent on the lining is longer than the outer fabric. I did this to prevent the lining from potentially moving from the inside of the dress to the outside of the dress, even if it was just by 1 millimeter. I slip stitched the lining to the outer by hand at the open vent. Finally, I stitched the lining to the outer fabric just above the start of the slit as well. This was just another point where I had tacked the lining to the fabric. Again, the purpose is to keep the lining from shifting around too much. At this point, I had closed up the dress, and that's pretty much it for the alteration part. The true bane of this project was repairing the many tiny holes. It seems like every time I looked at the dress, I would see more holes, and this was heartbreaking after I thought that I had finally finished patching all of the holes. I do think most of them are moth holes, but I feel like even though this is a high quality fabric, the threads of the wool crepe seem like they are easily broken, so some of the holes may just be due to the nature of the fabric. I learned about this technique when I was searching for invisible mending over a year ago. I was actually looking for invisible mending techniques for knitwear, like fixing holes in sweaters, because I wasn't completely happy with just darning holes anymore. I came upon this very well filmed video from Goto Yoshiko demonstrating a repair technique called Kaketsugi, which her father developed, and it seems like he and she have perfected it as a duo. They own a clothing repair shop in central Japan. I'm linking her video, a national broadcast special on her and her dad that shows just how meticulous they are with their work, and another video from Downtown Tailors on YouTube where she uses the technique. So I didn't do a great job of filming many of my patching attempts, but basically what you do is cut a patch of fabric that should be big enough to cover the hole, and ideally then have an additional 1.5 centimeters or longer on each edge of the minimum square or rectangle you want to use to cover the hole. I was kind of limited by the amount of fabric that I had taken off the dress. You basically pull apart the threads at the edges to expose the warp and weft threads. Then you place the patch on top of your hole, and using a loop of thread that's threaded through a needle, you grab each thread to pull it through the outer fabric. I had a little bit more work to do making these patches because this is a double wool crepe, so it had many woven layers. I had never worked with this type of fabric before, so the very first patch that I did, and you can see that at the very beginning of this section of the video, I didn't actually remove all the woven layers, so it sticks out a little bit more than the other patches. I probably won't go back to fix it because I already ironed on the fusible interfacing to the patches and closed up the lining. But sewing always brings out my obsessive compulsive tendencies, so I'll probably actually have opened up the lining to replace the patch by the time this video goes up, if I'm being totally honest with myself. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes or several minutes going over the one filming session that I thought was acceptable. After I had closed the dress, I decided that I would try to mend the hold on the aubergine trim at the neck. I had mentioned earlier in the video I was probably not going to do it, but after doing nearly 30 patches at this point, I was a little bit more confident. I also mended the other holes on the strap after working on this patch. Just a note, I can't iron on fusible interfacing for the holes that I patched here because I'm not opening up the straps in the dress to do that. However, if you really want to secure your patches, you should iron them with a fusible interface to maintain your repair for as long as possible. I made the patch, and here I'm just centering it over the hole. You can tack the patch over the hole to help prevent it from slipping around when you start pulling the threads. In the beginning I didn't do that, and I had to redo some of the patches because they would slip around and wouldn't end up over the center of the hole. I chose to pin the patch, which you can also do, or just tack it. For this particular area, I ended up using these fabric clips or clamps to help me flatten the area because the patch is going over the folded edge. So I've done that, and I just start looping individual threads through the fabric. In my case, I was usually grabbing 2 threads at the same time and pulling that through. I had to consistently use tweezers to help me guide the woven thread through the looper. Because I could only make small patches, my threads were usually a little short, at least either on the weft or the warp edge. The the best practice is to push the needle to the back of the fabric, and then while you have your hold on the needle on the front, push the needle back to the front of the fabric. You should be able to pull the needle back through to the same surface that you're working on. I make this point because actually when I was patching the first 22 patches, I didn't actually rewatch the video by Goto Yoshiko. I was going off of memory, and what I was doing was actually pulling the thread and needle completely through to the back of the fabric, and then grabbing the needle on the back side of the fabric to bring it back to the front before looping another thread. This actually slowed me down a lot because many of the patches were placed far from where I had opened the lining, so it was a lot more moving my arms around than necessary. The key point I want to make is that you should push your thread through behind the fabric and then back up the fabric so you don't have to move your hand behind the fabric to grab the needle again. I hope this demo with the piece of paper helps. Another key point here with small patches and short threads, every time I started pulling the thread through the fabric, I would make sure to secure the threads on the opposite side with either my finger or my fingernails to prevent completely pulling the entire thread out of the patch, which happened a few times. If you have a larger patch, you don't have to push down the thread all the way at the opposite side of the patch. Just push down the thread near the open edge that you're working on. So you continue doing this until you finish an edge. I wanted to note something else. I'm going to slow this down so you can see that I used the needle to kind of push the threads that I was going to catch with the loop to the side with no threads. In this case, I'm pushing threads to the right side just to help me separate the thread from the rest of them to make it easier to loop just the ones that I'm targeting. I also demonstrated this with the piece of paper earlier. I'm going to let this go at the normal speed so you can see a few more threads being pulled before speeding up the video. I made these clips when I had done 22 patches and naively thought that I was done. I ended up patching 12 more holes. I'm happy overall with this repair. I wasn't happy doing it after the first handful of patches, but I'm confident about using this technique in the future. Ironically, I think having so many holes to patch was a good thing. The patches are randomly placed, but because there are so many of them spread around the garment, they look sort of purposeful, like they're meant to be there. At least they do to me. If I had been more meticulous, the patches would have blended in more, but I had neither the patience, time, nor the back strength to do so with so many holes to repair. But overall, like I said, I'm happy with it, and now it's a wearable garment. Here's the before. Prada has their entire archive online, so you can go through all the shows. This is the dress on the runway. I do love the original cut of the dress, I just don't think it suits me. Alternatively, I think I could have taken it in just a little bit and shortened it to stay really true to the design and have it suit my proportions, but I'm really happy with the choices I ended up making. Some key points are to work slowly and don't make any rash decisions when you're tired. Just take a break and leave it until the next day at least. Now let's put together some outfits. Thanks so much for joining me on this alteration journey. I'll see you in the next one. It was so hard narrating this, my voice is tired. I don't know how people who record audiobooks do it. Apologies for all the plane and air conditioning noise. Be safe and make sure you look down at your feet when you're putting on 3-inch heels.